may be seated. So this morning, if you were here last week, you'll know that we started a new sermon series based on the life of Elijah. So life lessons from Elijah. What can we learn from this interesting prophet? Now, let me give you just a little bit of background, kind of some catch up if you weren't here, or maybe you forgot because we've all slept since then, right? So we got some things to remember. So in the time of Elijah, the kingdom of Israel was broken into two. We had northern kingdom and we had the southern kingdom. And both of them were run by some pretty terrible kings. I mean, not great people. And at Elijah's time, he was in the northern kingdom, and he was prophet during the time of King Ahab. Now, King Ahab was not a great guy. Not only did he do all the sins of his previous kings, but he also did things worse. He married Jezebel. And now, you've probably heard this name Jezebel before. We still use it in our culture to mean a woman of ill repute, really. And so Jezebel was not a great woman. She came from the time, or the place of Sidon, and it was a place where they really worshipped the false god Baal, or Baal, however you want to say it. And so they were married, and really this was a brilliant political move. Right? There were some big nations really starting to take power at this time, and the northern kingdom was just a little piece of land. And so it really was a brilliant political move if all you cared about was military and politics. Because, the region of Sidon was on the harbor. It was near the Mediterranean Sea. They were able to trade a lot. They had a really fortified military. And so this partnership seemed really good politically. But, religiously or spiritually, this was not so great. Jezebel, with the understanding of her husband, started to lead the people into, worshiping these false gods. Started to erect temples for the god Baal, and started to set up Asherah poles for the goddess Asherah. And really, it was this political and kingdom-led worship of false gods. All but our worship of Yahweh was almost completely wiped out. This was a difficult time, and so this is where Elijah finds himself in this time. A prophet during the time of King Ahab and Jezebel. And at this time, we find out in the beginning of our chapter today, as we read chapter 18, that Jezebel was going around, not her herself, but her people, were going around and gathering all of the prophets of Yahweh and having them killed. And Obadiah, who was the head of the administration in the castle, or in the kingdom, he actually was a faithful follower of Yahweh, so he tried to save as many as he could. He collected 100 prophets of God and hid them away in caves. Elijah was the only one left. And Obadiah did what he could to protect Elijah. But at this point in our story today, as we come to it, Elijah has prophesied that there would be no rain for 3.5 years. He's told Ahab up front. And Ahab has been looking for Elijah. Elijah's been on the run, been hiding out. God's been protecting him. We talked about that last week. But now, Elijah steps up to Ahab. He steps up to Ahab and says, rain is coming. Get ready for it. You see, they were looking for Elijah. They wanted to kill Elijah because they believed that their god Baal, or this worship that they were giving to Baal, it wasn't satisfactory because Elijah had prophesied a drought. It made this false god angry, so the only way that there was going to be rain was for Elijah to be killed. So they were on the hunt for him, but Elijah steps out. God calls him out and says, this drought is going to end. Something is going to happen right now. And this is where we find ourselves in our story today. Now, last week we learned that our lesson from Elijah was obedience. But this week we're going to learn something different. We're not just going to learn about obedience. We're going to learn about Elijah's confidence. Elijah is confident, which is kind of surprising when you think about it, right? Like, he's in the middle of a pretty big mess, and yet he is confident. So that is our lesson today. We're going to learn about how Elijah is confident. Now, confidence is something we normally talk about having too much of or not enough of. Not very often we talk about having just the right amount of confidence, especially from a spiritual point of view. But being too confident or not confident enough. Let me give you a little story. Layla's going to laugh at me. So this week I was cooking. I like to cook. And I had a pan full of onions, right? Chopped onions. And you know how they do it on the shows? You know, they shake it a little and they flip it, right? Oh, I did it. I did it really well. And of course, my husband wasn't in the room. Layla was on her phone. And I was like, you know what? I did it once. Surely I can do it again, right? So I'm like, hey, Layla, watch this. So I shake the pan a little bit. And I flip it a little harder than I probably should have. Because I wanted it to be a little more impressive, right? I was confident in myself. I'd done it once. I could do it again. Well, it looked beautiful. And then it landed on the stove. It didn't land back in the pan. Maybe half of them landed back in the pan. So Layla got a good laugh, and I got to clean the kitchen. I was a little overconfident in my chefing abilities, but you know what? Sometimes we do struggle with where do we find that line of confidence, and what do we put our confidence in? Do we put our confidence in ourselves and our own abilities? Sometimes that will fail us, as I showed myself when I was trying to flip those onions. Sometimes when we put our confidence in the right place, though, it does some really interesting things for us. Confidence is a full trust, a belief in the powers, trustworthiness, or reliability of a person or a thing. And in this story of Elijah that we're about to read through, we learn that his confidence is not in himself. Elijah doesn't have confidence in himself, but he has his confidence in its rightful place, in the God that he walks with daily, the God that he spends time with, who he prays to. So let's see what we can learn from Elijah this morning as we read through the story of Mount Carmel. So we're going to read starting in verse 16 today. It's 1 Kings chapter 18, starting in verse 16. We're going to read a little bit at a time, and then we'll talk about it and come back to it. So 16 through 21 today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. When he saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is that you, troubler of Israel?" "I have not made trouble for Israel," Elijah replied. "But you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed Baal's. So summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent word throughout all of Israel and assembled the prophets on the Mount Carmel. Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal is God, follow him." But the people said nothing. This is such an interesting story. Elijah comes out of hiding, goes to Obadiah, and Obadiah says, "All right, I'll go get King Ahab if that's what you say." And Elijah presents himself in front of King Ahab. It's time for a face-off. It's time to see once and for all who is the rightful God. Is it Baal? Or is it Yahweh? And so he asks Ahab to collect all the people, to bring everyone up to the mountain. And I love what Ahab says here. He calls Elijah troubler of Israel. Now, Elijah's doing nothing but trying to bring the people back to God. It's Ahab himself who's the troubler of Israel. But Elijah doesn't seem scared. Maybe he is in his heart, but he seems so confident. And he asked Ahab to gather all the people, and Ahab didn't have to do this, right? Ahab's the king. He didn't have to call all the people, but he was confident too. Perhaps confident in the wrong thing. So he calls all the prophets, all the prophetesses, calls all the people of Israel, and they all go to Mount Carmel. And Elijah addresses the people there. And he says, "Which one are you going to choose?" You see, here's the problem. The people are limping between gods and God. It says waver here, but in the Greek it actually means limping. It means that you're not sure-footed on either side. You can't make a decision. You see, this is a time and a place in the world where there is a pantheon, several pantheons of gods. There would be so many to choose from. So maybe the people of God are trying to hedge their bets. Maybe they're just persuaded by King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. Whatever it was, they were limping between the two gods. They could not figure out which way to go. Either way, they weren't sure, because they didn't say anything. They didn't say they were on the side of King Ahab and Jezebel and saying that Baal was God. They didn't say yes to Yahweh either. They were stuck in between. And I'll tell you what, today we have this same problem. We still struggle today with the same thing because there are overwhelming options for allegiance that leaves us lukewarm, right? Think about all the things you could spend your time on today. You could spend your money on. You could spend any number of things on. There is so many options, so many idols out there that we tend to give our time and our energy to. We fall into this trap just as easily. And it may not be about which God we proclaim. We may say we follow God, but yet our hearts and our resources and everything we do follow something else. It is unbelievable the amount of idols that are available to us today to pull at our attention, to pull at who we are, and it steals from us. We find ourselves limited in so many areas when we are not focused first on who God is. I think about it this way. I think about, especially when we think about advertising. You look up one thing on Google, and for the next 3 months, you're going to see that one thing in every ad you have, right? Every single one. It's crazy. Even now, Alexa will say, hey, you searched for this item. You know, when I'm in the kitchen flipping my onions, she'll say something on the Alexa and say, hey, you want this thing? Over and over again, in this culture that we have, we are constantly bombarded with things that will take our time and our energy, and we end up being lukewarm about all of them. There's nothing that we end up having a passion for. It steals our resources from us, and we don't get to spend the time with God that we hope that we would. It's a way for us to focus on consumerism, all of these idols. And the enemy knows the desires of our flesh, and you better believe that he's working on all of them. It's a problem that we struggle with today too. We're not far from the Israelites. But let us look a little further into our story. 1 Kings 18, verses 22 through 29. Then Elijah said to them, I am the only one of the Lord's prophets left, but Baal has 450 prophets. So get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He is God. Then all the people said, what you say is good. Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one of the bulls and prepare it first, since there are so many of you. Call on the name of your God, but do not light the fire. So they took the bull given to it and prepared it. They called on the name of Baal from morning until noon. Baal, answer us, they shouted. But there was no response. No one answered. And they danced around the altar they had made. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them. Shout louder, he said. Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is in deep thought, or busy, or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. So they shouted louder and slashed themselves with swords and spears, as was their custom, until their blood flowed. And midday passed, and they continued their frantic prophesying until the time for the evening sacrifice. But there was no response. No one answered, and no one paid attention. See, Elijah offers a competition of the gods. He wanted to make it so that it was as fair as possible, but he actually gave the prophets of Baal every advantage. They got to choose the bull first. They got to be at their place. Actually, Mount Carmel was a place of Baal worship. I mean, first it was God's, but second it was his. So the location seemed to be in their favor. There were 450 prophets trying to butcher and prepare one bull. I mean, this should have been nice and easy, right? So he gave them every advantage. So they went off and did their thing, right? They did their prophesying, they did their praising, they did all that they could do, and there was no answer. And then Elijah starts to get a little talky, right? He starts to taunt them a little bit. Not so becoming of him, I suppose, but he's trying to help the people around to see that this God that you've been proclaiming is not answering, right? I wouldn't suggest this tactic, of course, but it is what it is. We read this from Elijah. So they went off, then they started to dance. They started to prophesy louder. And Elijah, after he's done with his taunting, he watches as the prophets do all that they can do. They shouted louder, they slashed themselves, and they got frantic when they realized nothing was happening. But no one answered. You see, here's the problem. The problem in this story is that misplaced confidence produces no results. When we put our confidence in places where it's misplaced, when it's not in the right spot. I mean, I'm sure that these prophets were confident. I mean, they were supported and sponsored by the government. They were eating at the table of the queen. They had a high place in society. They were confident in what they were doing. And yet, when push comes to shove, their God was not there. Their God did not respond. No matter what they did to attract the attention of their false god, nothing worked. They had confidence in themselves and in their prophesying, in what they could do to attract the attention of a God who was never there. And they failed. Today, we have a similar problem because misplaced confidence leaves us frantically trying to measure up. When we try too hard, when we put all of our confidence in ourselves and in our ability and in our own success, we end up finding that we just can't measure up. There's so many decisions that we have to make. I even think about it, being a youth pastor for so long, I think about how we ask our kids to make decisions for the rest of their life when they're 17 and 18 years old. That's a lot of pressure. Where are you going to school? What are you going to study? How are you going to get there? What kind of job are you going to get? We have all of these things, and we put so much pressure on our children, and even not just when they graduate, but I think about sports, and I think about being the best, getting the best grades, so much pressure. And when they fail, they're crushed. When we put all of our confidence in our own success and we mess up, it feels like a huge failure. That's not where our confidence should be. Our confidence shouldn't be in that place. Instead, it should be somewhere else. So let's read where our confidence should be. Starting in Kings 18, verses 30 through 39, the end of our story. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come here to me." And they came to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. Elijah took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes descended from Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Your name shall be Israel." With the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he dug a trench around it large enough to hold 2 seahs of seed. He arranged the wood, cut the bull into pieces, and laid it on the wood. And he said to them, "Fill 4 large jars with water and pour it on the offering and on the wood." "Do it again," he said. And they did it again. "Do it a 3rd time," he ordered. And they did it a 3rd time. The water ran down the altar and even filled the trench. At the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and he prayed, "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant. And I have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord. Answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Then fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, the wood, the stone, the soil, and also licked up all the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." This is where our confidence should lie. Our confidence should lie in God. lie in the God who is with us. Here's the truth. God inspires confidence even when it doesn't make sense. You see, God asked Elijah to do some pretty crazy things. To take this sacrifice and cover it in water. Remember, they are in a 3.5-year drought. So they're taking their most precious commodity, 12 large jars of water, and dumping it on this sacrifice. Talk about giving the other prophets every advantage. Have you ever tried to start a fire with wet wood? Like, it doesn't really happen, right? Doesn't seem to make sense, but he had confidence in God, and he prayed. He didn't prophesy. He didn't dance. He didn't slash himself. He stopped and knelt before God. This is the point. Friends, God inspires us today to have confidence. You see, we can model today. We can model Elijah's confident faith. He does this in a number of ways, and I want to share with you just really quick as we end our time, prepare for communion, 4 quick ways that we in this life right now can model this confident faith in God. First, I think that what Elijah did was incredible. He asked others to draw near. Up on that mountain, as other people had watched the prophets of Baal fail, he invited people to come close, to watch, to pay attention. Friends, in this life, we're not supposed to walk alone. We are disciples who are called to make disciples. And you know how we do that? As we walk with God, we invite other people to walk with us, to come and see, to come and participate. We may not do everything right, but we invite people to join with us. If you're not in a Bible study or a small group and you don't have people that you're spending your life with, I encourage you to start one or come and talk to me and we'll get one started, because doing life together makes all the difference. Draw people close and worship God together. Here's another way we can be confident. We need to assess the altars in our life. Elijah took an altar that once was God's, had been knocked down for the prophet or for the god Baal. He rebuilt it slowly and methodically. Something that was once God's had been ruined, he rebuilt on purpose. So many times I give things to God, and then eventually I take them back. Or I give something to God, and then I walk away. I knock it over. We need to assess the places in our life where we've given something over to God and then taken it back. To rebuild those altars and truly give our lives back to God. Here's the next one. We need to trust God's voice. I guarantee you that as Elijah was building, I mean, think about this. As one man, to build an altar, then to butcher a bull, and then to cover it in water would have taken a long time. A long time. And he was inviting people to watch him. So he was in the middle, and I guarantee you that this man was praying. We've learned from Elijah that he has a close relationship with God, and he trusted in God's voice even when it didn't make sense. He trusted, and he knew that God was going to carry him. His confidence was in God. And so we need to learn to trust God's voice. And the only way to trust God's voice is if we listen to it. And we'll talk more about that in a couple weeks. But right now, let's practice listening to God's voice so that we can trust who he is. When he offers us opportunities, that we take them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it doesn't seem quite right. We have to trust God's voice. And here's the last thing. When you pray and when you worship, focus on God's character first. God has always been a deliverer. God has always kept his promises. God has always continued to love us even when we don't love ourselves. And so we need to trust in his character and not the problems that we're facing. I'm sure that standing on Mount Carmel with 450 prophets on the other side, and you're here by yourself, it probably feels a bit overwhelming. I'm sure that Elijah felt a little overwhelmed, maybe a little out of place even. But he could trust in God's character. He's been there for him before, and he would do it again. So we trust in the character of God as we pray and as we worship. I heard this story this week. Actually, yesterday I was in a training for a Breakthrough Prayer Initiative, and the woman who was leading the training told this story that she had read in a book. It's about a young girl who was living in California, and they didn't get a lot of storms there, but there was this really big thunderstorm, so it was new for her. And she was scared, and nothing the parents could do could calm this little girl down in the storm. And finally, the mom said, "Why don't you pray about it?" She says the little girl walks over to the window, raises her fist in the air, and says, "Jesus, you stop it right now." And wouldn't you know, the rain stopped. Can you believe that? This pastor tells the story of his daughter, and the rain actually stopped. You know why? Because God heard her prayer. She had confidence. Childlike faith is not about being innocent. Childlike faith is about confidence. Confidence in the God who has heard us and the God who is with us. So this morning, as we come together, as we're here in worship, and sometimes we struggle with confidence in God. We struggle with misplacing our confidence in ourselves and in what we can achieve and in what we can do. But this morning, I invite us, as we prepare to take communion together, the Lord's Supper together, let us reframe our confidence. That it would not be in ourselves and in what we can accomplish, but in the God who saves, the God who loves, the God who is constantly with us in good times and in bad. So this morning, we're going to come to the table, and we're going to worship through the eating of a meal that God offers us. He offers us forgiveness for when we've made mistakes. He offers us new life every day. And that's what we'll partake in today. As one community, we will celebrate together. And so this morning, in just a moment, we'll bless the elements. But first, I want to take just a moment in prayer. A moment to lift up our prayers to God. To offer a moment of confession. A moment of hope. A moment of recentering and fixing the altars in our life. So I'll lead us in a prayer, and I'll take a moment of quiet. And I invite you during that time of quiet to lift up your confession, to say what you need to say to God. And then we'll partake in this meal together. So let us go to God this morning in a moment of prayer. Holy God, we come before you. As we think about Elijah and we think about his confidence and we think about the way that he models that for us in this story, that he was so close to you, he was listening to you, he could trust in your voice. God, we call upon you this morning that you would just convict our hearts, that we might be able to put before you our hurts and our pains and our worries, that we might be able to lay those things down so that we can fully trust in your voice, that we can give over our lives to you and for your service. So God, as we prepare to come to the table this morning, help us to know you. Help us to hear you. And help us to confess that which we've done wrong or ways we've been unfaithful. So let us take a few moments in confession.